In a racially divided southern town, Jesse, a bright black teen, is wrongfully accused of a crime. Meanwhile, Dylan, the sheriff's son, must confront his father's prejudice and his own silence. Their lives collide, forcing both to make difficult choices that challenge the town's deep-seated divisions. Grayston was a town where the seasons passed slowly, with summers that seemed to stretch forever and winters that arrived only as whispers of cold. The town's stillness reflected its residents, people who took pride in tradition, routine, and the comforting belief that their way of life had endured for generations without need for change. But beneath this facade, Grayston carried a darker history, a history of division and inequity so ingrained that most of the town's people hardly noticed it anymore. It was simply the way things were. Nestled between the cotton fields and old cracked roads, Grayston was split into two parts, though no map ever showed this invisible divide. On one side were the white families, whose stately homes boasted freshly painted shutters, wide porches with rocking chairs, and lawns that seemed as endless and pristine as the lives they led. The Ridge, as the other side of town was called, was home to the black families. The houses there, though full of life and love, were older, worn from years of being passed down from generation to generation, always under the weight of systemic neglect. People in Grayston coexisted, but they didn't interact much, keeping their lives separate, as though by some unspoken agreement that had existed since before anyone could remember. The few interactions that did occur were often transactional: a quick exchange at the market, a passing nod at church, a shared glance at the school auditorium during sporting events. But real friendships, real relationships between the two sides of town were rare. It wasn't that anyone openly acknowledged this separation. It was just that everyone had learned to live within it, to accept the boundaries as natural. Jesse Thompson, a 17-year-old black boy, lived in the Ridge with his grandmother Rose and his younger sister Maya. His father had died when he was just a boy, and his mother worked as a nurse in another state, sending money home whenever she could. It was Rose who raised him, a woman of quiet strength who had seen the world change, and yet in some ways stay the same. Rose was no stranger to the ways of Grayston. She had grown up there and knew its prejudices well. She'd raised Jesse with the wisdom of someone who understood that, in places like Grayston, surviving sometimes meant knowing when to stay silent. Jesse was different, though. He carried a fire within him, a yearning to make something of himself, to escape the quiet suffocation of Grayston. He was a bright student, the top of his class, and a standout athlete. His basketball skills had already caught the attention of college recruiters, and he had dreams of leaving Grayston behind to study law, to become a lawyer and fight for justice in places where it was too often denied. He had his eyes set on a future far away from the fields and fences that surrounded his life. But even as Jesse dreamed, he knew that his path wouldn't be easy. Grayston wasn't the kind of place that let young black men rise without a fight. At school, he felt the weight of expectations pressing down on him. His teachers praised him, yes, but there was always an undercurrent of surprise, as if they couldn't quite believe that someone from the Ridge could be so intelligent, so driven. His classmates admired his skills on the basketball court, but often kept their distance outside of games. Even his friends, those who had grown up alongside him, knew that there was a line they couldn't cross. Jesse was expected to know his place, to be humble, quiet, and grateful for whatever scraps of opportunity the town threw his way. Across town, Dylan Wallace lived a life that, at first glance, seemed worlds apart from Jesse's. Dylan's father, Sheriff Wallace, was the town's most powerful figure, a man whose presence commanded respect and whose authority went unquestioned. Sheriff Wallace was the embodiment of Grayston's traditions, a man who believed in the old ways and enforced them with a heavy hand. Dylan had grown up in the shadow of that authority, the weight of his father's expectations bearing down on him as much as the town's unspoken rules weighed on Jesse. Dylan was smart, though not in the way Jesse was. He was a thoughtful boy, introspective, often questioning the world around him. But those questions, those doubts about the way things were, rarely left his mind. He had learned long ago that challenging his father's beliefs was a dangerous thing to do. Sheriff Wallace was a man of few words, But his actions spoke volumes. Dylan had seen the way his father dealt with people who stepped out of line, how swift and unforgiving his justice could be. Dylan wasn't like his father, not really. He had grown up seeing the cracks in Grayston's facade, noticing the subtle ways people treated each other, and sensing that something wasn't right. But for all his awareness, Dylan had never found the courage to speak out. His silence weighed on him, especially when he saw how people like Jesse were treated. Dylan had gone to school with Jesse for years, but they had never really known each other. They lived in the same town but in entirely different worlds. That was all about to change. It was a sweltering summer evening when Grayston was jolted from its quiet routine by an act of defiance that no one saw coming. The next morning, the townspeople awoke to find their beloved courthouse defaced with graffiti. Scrawled in bold black letters across the pristine white stone were the words, "Justice for all." To some, the message was a call for equality, a demand for fairness in a town that had long denied it to many. But for others, the graffiti was an act of rebellion, a challenge to the order that Sheriff Wallace had worked so hard to maintain. The courthouse was more than just a building. It was a symbol of Grayston's authority, of its way of life. And to deface it was, in the sheriff's eyes, an unforgivable crime. Sheriff Wallace wasted no time in launching an investigation, but it was clear from the start that his search for the culprits was more about assigning blame than uncovering the truth. Within hours, the sheriff had turned his attention to the young black boys from the ridge. No evidence had been gathered, but to Sheriff Wallace, the case was simple. The words "justice for all" were, to him, a threat that only could have come from those who felt wronged by the system he upheld. Jesse Thompson's name rose to the top of the suspect list almost immediately. It started with a whisper. A rumor passed from one person to another until it reached the sheriff's ears. A local shopkeeper claimed to have seen Jesse near the courthouse the night of the vandalism, though his account was vague and full of inconsistencies. Still, in a town like Grayston, a rumor was all it took to turn suspicion into certainty. Soon, Jesse's name was being spoken in hushed tones throughout the town. His classmates, once friendly if distant, began to avoid him. His teachers, who had once praised his academic achievements, now treated him with a kind of wary detachment. Even people in the Ridge, those who had known Jesse his whole life, looked at him with a mix of sympathy and fear, as though they knew what was coming and felt powerless to stop it. At home, Jesse's grandmother Rose tried to reassure him, but even she couldn't hide her worry. "This town ain't never been fair, Jesse," she told him one evening, as they sat together in the fading light of their porch. "But you keep your head down, you hear? Don't give them no reason to come after you?" Jesse nodded, but inside, he felt a storm brewing. He hadn't done anything wrong. He had been at home that night, helping his grandmother prepare dinner while his sister worked on her homework at the kitchen table. But the truth didn't seem to matter. The town had already made up its mind, and the more Jesse tried to stay quiet, the more suffocating the weight of the accusations became. Then, the sheriff made his move. He announced publicly that Jesse Thompson was the prime suspect in the courthouse vandalism and that he would be brought in for questioning. The news spread like wildfire, and soon Jesse found himself at the center of a storm he hadn't seen coming. Fear gripped him. He had heard stories from other boys in the Ridge about what happened when Sheriff Wallace decided to make an example out of someone. They weren't given a fair chance. The system was stacked against them from the start. Jesse knew that, once the sheriff had set his sights on him, there was little chance of escaping unscathed. He thought about running. Packing a bag and disappearing into the night seemed like the only way to avoid the sheriff's wrath. But his sister Maya begged him not to leave, and his grandmother reminded him that running would only make things worse. "The truth will come out, Jesse," she said, her voice soft but firm. "You just gotta stand tall and let them do what they will. You ain't got nothing to hide." Across town, Dylan Wallace overheard his father talking about the case over dinner. Sheriff Wallace's voice was thick with anger as he described the graffiti as an attack on the town's values, on its very soul. "We'll teach them a lesson," the sheriff said, his tone cold and unyielding. "We don't need evidence. Everyone knows what those boys from the Ridge are capable of. Always looking for trouble, always trying to stir things up." Dylan sat silently at the table, his stomach churning with guilt. He had never questioned his father before. never dared to challenge the authority that Sheriff Wallace wielded so effortlessly. But this time, something inside Dylan rebelled. He knew Jesse. He had seen him in school, seen the way teachers talked about him, the way his classmates admired him. Jesse wasn't a troublemaker. He wasn't the type to vandalize a courthouse, to challenge the law. That night, Dylan lay awake in bed, the weight of his silence pressing down on him. He knew that if he did nothing, if he let his father go after Jesse without saying a word, he would be complicit in whatever happened next. But speaking out meant challenging not just his father, but everything he had been raised to believe. It meant risking the life he had always known for the sake of someone he barely knew. Still, Dylan couldn't shake the feeling that he had a responsibility to do something. The graffiti on the courthouse wall had stirred something in him, a deep, uncomfortable awareness that justice, real justice, was a rare thing in Grayston. And as the words, "justice for all," echoed in his mind, Dylan knew that he couldn't stay silent any longer. The day of Jesse's interrogation arrived like a dark cloud over the town. The sun hung high in the sky, beating down on Grayston as if to drive the tension deeper into the ground. People watched from their porches and behind half-closed blinds as Jesse walked through the streets toward the sheriff's office, his heart pounding in his chest. The air was thick with anticipation, and Jesse could feel the weight of the town's eyes on him, judging him before he had even set foot inside. Inside the sheriff's office, the air was stifling, heavy with the oppressive authority that Sheriff Wallace radiated from behind his desk. The sheriff wasted no time, launching into his interrogation with the intensity of a man determined not to discover the truth, but to make Jesse confess to something he hadn't done. "Where were you the night the courthouse was vandalized?" the sheriff demanded, his voice sharp and accusatory. "I was at home," Jesse replied, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. "I was with my grandmother and sister. We were having dinner." "Do you expect me to believe that?" the sheriff scoffed, leaning forward, his eyes narrowing as if he could will Jesse into confessing. "You think I don't know what you boys from the Ridge get up to? You think I don't know what goes on when people like you think no one's watching?" Jesse's fists clenched under the table, the anger rising in him like a wave he had spent years trying to hold back. He wanted to shout, to stand up and tell the sheriff exactly what he thought of him, of this whole town. But he knew that anger wouldn't help him here. It would only confirm what the sheriff already believed about him, that he was dangerous, a threat. So Jesse stayed calm. He answered the sheriff's questions with the same truth he had been telling all along. But with each passing minute, it became clearer that the sheriff didn't care about the truth. He cared only about proving his own narrative. Just when it seemed like the situation couldn't get any worse, the door to the office creaked open. Sheriff Wallace looked up, his face twisted in irritation at the interruption. But when he saw who it was, his expression changed from annoyance to something closer to disbelief. Dylan stood in the doorway, his face pale but determined. His hands shook slightly as he stepped into the room, but his eyes held a resolve that hadn't been there before. "Dad," Dylan began, his voice shaky but growing stronger with each word, "this isn't right." The room went still. Sheriff Wallace's eyes darkened and his jaw clenched. "Dylan, this is none of your concern," the sheriff growled, his voice low and dangerous. "Leave." But Dylan didn't move. He took a deep breath, steadying himself before he spoke again. "It is my concern," he said firmly. "Jesse didn't do this. He's innocent." The sheriff's face flushed with anger, his eyes narrowing in disbelief. "You don't know that," he said, his voice tight with barely controlled rage. "I do know that," Dylan insisted. "I've talked to people who saw Jesse at home that night. He didn't go near the courthouse, and I found out who really did it. Some kids from the other side of town were seen near the courthouse that night. They're the ones who did this, not Jesse." Sheriff Wallace stared at his son, the anger in his eyes giving way to something else, something closer to shame. For a long moment, the room was silent, the tension thick and heavy. The sheriff's fists tightened on the edge of his desk, his knuckles turning white. "You've been investigating behind my back?" the sheriff finally asked, his voice a low, dangerous growl. Dylan nodded, his heart racing. "Because I knew you wouldn't," he said, his voice steady. You were ready to blame Jesse from the start because it was easy, because it fit what you already believed. The words hung in the air, and for a moment it seemed like the sheriff might lash out. But then, slowly, the anger drained from his face, replaced by something that looked like defeat. After what felt like an eternity, Sheriff Wallace sighed, his shoulders slumping. He looked at Jesse, then back at Dylan, and finally he spoke. "Jesse," the sheriff said quietly, his voice strained. "You're free to go." Jesse left the sheriff's office, but the weight of what had happened lingered in his chest like a heavy stone. He was free, yes, but he couldn't shake the feeling that his innocence hadn't really mattered. The town had been ready to condemn him without a second thought, based on nothing more than a rumor and the color of his skin. As he walked through the streets of Grayston, he felt the eyes of the townspeople on him, some full of guilt, others still filled with suspicion. He could sense the discomfort in the air, the way people shifted uneasily when they saw him, as though they didn't quite know how to reconcile what had just happened with their understanding of the world. For Jesse, the experience had revealed something deeper, something he had always known but had never been forced to confront so directly. Greyston was a town built on quiet prejudice, a place where people like him were expected to stay in their place, to be grateful for whatever opportunities they were given, and never to ask for more. The town had tried to break him, and while it hadn't succeeded, Jesse knew that this was only the beginning of a longer, harder fight. At home, his grandmother embraced him, relief washing over her face. But even as they celebrated his release, there was an unspoken understanding between them. Jesse's freedom hadn't come because the town had suddenly realized its mistake. It had come because someone, Dylan, had chosen to speak up, and that made all the difference. Across town, Dylan faced his own reckoning. His relationship with his father was fractured, possibly beyond repair. Sheriff Wallace, a man who had spent his life enforcing the rules of Grayston, now looked at his son with a mixture of disappointment and something approaching resentment. Dylan had challenged not only his father's authority, but the very fabric of the town's order, and that was not something easily forgiven. Some people in town praised Dylan for his courage, calling him a hero for standing up for what was right. But others saw him as a traitor, someone who had betrayed his family and their way of life. Dylan didn't care much about the praise or the criticism. What mattered to him was that, for the first time, he had acted on his own sense of justice, rather than simply going along with the way things had always been. But that didn't make the consequences any easier to bear. In the weeks that followed, life in Grayston returned to its usual rhythms, though a subtle shift had taken place beneath the surface. Quiet conversations began to emerge, whispers about what had happened, about how Jesse had been unfairly accused, and how Dylan had stood up to his father. For the first time in a long while, people in Grayston were starting to question the things they had always accepted without thought. The divide between the Ridge and the rest of the town didn't dissolve overnight. Old prejudices ran deep, and change was slow. But the graffiti on the courthouse wall had sparked something, a conversation, a reckoning with the past and the present that couldn't easily be ignored. At school, Jesse was selected to give a speech at the end-of-year assembly, a recognition of his academic achievements and a nod to the ordeal he had been through. As he stood in front of his classmates, his teachers, and even some of the townspeople who had once suspected him, Jesse felt a wave of emotions, anger, sadness, and a quiet, steady hope. He didn't speak with bitterness or resentment. Instead, Jesse talked about the future, about the kind of town Grayston could become if people were willing to change, if they were willing to confront the prejudices that had kept them divided for so long. He spoke about justice, real justice, and how it couldn't exist if people stayed silent in the face of wrong. Justice, Jesse said, his voice strong and clear, isn't something that just happens. It's something we have to fight for. It's something we have to be brave enough to demand, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it means standing up to the people we love. Jesse didn't sugarcoat the challenges that lay ahead. He knew that the fight for equality, for real change, would be long and difficult. But as he looked out at the faces in the crowd, his classmates, his neighbors, even his teachers, he felt a glimmer of hope. Things were beginning to shift, and though it would take time, Jesse believed that Grayston could become a place where justice truly was for all. As the crowd applauded, Jesse stood tall, his heart filled with resolve. He knew now, more than ever, that his dream of becoming a lawyer and fighting for justice wasn't just a dream. It was a necessity. He would leave Grayston one day, go to college, and fulfill his destiny. But before he did, he would make sure that the town he left behind was better than the one he had grown up in. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story and its message, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more thought-provoking tales. Your support means a lot, and we hope to see you back here for the next video. Stay tuned, and until next time, keep the conversation going.